Welcome to the fifth session of this series. We're so glad that you're here. My name is Lauren McKenna. I'm with Green Schoolyards America, and supporting me today are my wonderful colleagues, Allison Torres and Michaela Randolph. Okay, so on to today's lecture, Fires, Vegetation, and Schoolyards in the Wildland Urban Interface. Our guest speaker today will share an overview of the WUI, the Wildland Urban Interface, how vegetation differs between this space and urban areas, and how this shapes how we can and should be doing regarding fire in our urban landscapes, especially given the many, many benefits of trees and vegetation, and all the benefits that they have in our communities as well as our schools. And so, though this is applicable to broadly across all of our communities, be thinking about your own local school communities and how this connects. Our speaker is Dr. Francisco Escobedo. He is a research social scientist with the USDA Forest Service in the Pacific Southwest Research Station and the Los Angeles Urban Center. Formerly, he was an associate professor of urban and community forestry at the University of Florida. He began his career as a firefighter, soil scientist, and forester with the U.S. Forest Service. His research focuses on the environmental sustainability and resilience of communities and ecosystems in urban areas, as well as the wildland urban interface. He has a PhD in forest policy, an MS in watershed management, and a BS in soil science. We are so lucky to have him here to impart his wisdom and research. Welcome, Francisco. Welcome, Dr. Escobedo. I'll address you as Francisco per,
Yes.
per your request. We're so happy to have you here today. So, uh, with that, welcome, Francisco, and I'll have you take it away.
All right. Thank you, Lauren. I'm going to share my screen here. Okay. All right. Well,
Great,
thank you,
thank you.
Lauren, for that introduction. Um, as my bio says, I'm a research social scientist, so I have a background in policy and economics, but I started off as a firefighter and forester and a soil scientist, and I did a lot of work with fire in wildland areas, and I got kind of tired of it, and I decided to go work in communities. So I went into urban forestry. But as I'll lay out in the presentation, this problem of fire in communities as in urban areas has really kind of brought me back to this field. Okay. So what I'll try to do in this half hour, I'll talk a little bit about what the wildland urban interface is and what urban forests are. And as you'll see, differentiating these two concepts is really interesting in how we think about trees and vegetation and communities and how these systems are being impacted by wildfire. As we think through how to address this problem, it's important we differentiate between that. Okay. And then I'll summarize from past experience and from other research that other folks have been doing, research that we've been doing, research I've been doing, how fire impacts urban areas and how it impacts wildland urban interface areas, and how this concept of fire in cities, how it impacts communities and trees is something really new that a lot of us don't have a lot of information on. This is an area of research, so we'll try to show you some background research that we're beginning, some we finished, some's in progress. And the focus here will be on neighborhoods and communities. We haven't done any direct research with schools that were impacted by fire, but we have been working in those communities and in those areas where there are schools and there's communities that attend these schools that have been impacted by fire. Okay. So wildland urban interface. Wildland urban interface is a concept that's been around for a couple of decades, but it basically describes where structures, homes, buildings, barns, multi-family houses, single-family houses intermingle or meet with areas of natural vegetation. that have been undeveloped. So it has a geographical definition that we use to map these areas. Uh, it's often used for fire management. If we can map those areas, we can see where structures are near vegetation that can burn, and then we can plan, manage accordingly. But other disciplines, as in geography, urban planning, anthropologists even use this concept to describe this area where rural areas meet urban areas, how to understand the communities there, the dynamics. So it's a very broad definition used by a lot of disciplines. I've given here a couple of examples from the Forest Service, from the National Wildfire Coordination Group, the National Fire Protection Association, different criteria, the proximity of the structures next to each other, the groups of buildings relative to their distance relative to patches of vegetation. The one thing all these definitions have in common is that they talk about wildland vegetation, natural vegetation, and quote unquote structures or housing units, and their proximity and location relative to each other. So a very broad definition, again, used by a lot of different disciplines and organizations. So I'll give you an example of the definition we use here in California, but it's very similar to the definitions that's used across the United States. Okay, so wildland urban interface. I'll use the acronym WUI because it's shorter, but it's the geographical area where human development, including structures, right, when all those different types of buildings we talked about, and other infrastructure meets, intermixes with undeveloped wildlands. Okay, and I keep coming back to this term of wildland, so keep that in mind. But here in California, as in other places in the United States, we generally have three types of wildland urban interface areas. That's where urban areas meet areas of undeveloped vegetation. Intermix, these are groups of houses surrounded by vegetation. And we have a zone of influence that can sometimes go up to a mile and a half away from that interface, that boundary. Okay, and that mile and a half, that's meant to account for embers that can be transported up to 2 miles from the nearest fire. Okay, so these are zones where they could be potentially influenced by fire. This map you see is as the wildland urban interface in and around Altadena, California. That was one of the communities affected a year ago exactly by the fires we had here in Los Angeles. So that's the wildland urban interface areas, the three types. And then here you see the actual area that was affected by the fire. So you see a couple of different things here. You see that the fire went well into the urban core. In some areas, it went 14 blocks into the city. The intermix, seems to have been just completely almost not relevant because it was highly urbanized areas, supermarkets, hotels, apartment complexes were affected. So here you start seeing how this concept of wild land and structure starts getting fuzzy when we start going into the city. Okay, so that's wildland urban interface. Urban forests, we're going to switch channels a little bit here, is all the vegetation in and around cities. And it includes the watersheds, the soils, the habitats, street trees, park trees, private trees, trees in riparian areas, in both private and public properties. Okay, so if we switch to the urban forestry side, this is how we think of vegetation, not only in schools, not only in neighborhoods, but in the urban ecosystem. Okay, so a long line or history of management, research, information on all the benefits of urban forests and how we manage trees in cities, the arboricultural practices, the horticultural approaches to it. So long history. Just as in wildland urban interface, they have these disciplines and they've been thinking about this problem of fire in this wildland urban interface. We've been thinking about vegetation and its relationship relative to people in communities for a long time. Okay, but now with this new problem we're having, fires affecting neighborhoods, and as you'll see, it's just not here in California. This is kind of where these two disciplines are kind of butting heads a little bit. I'll put it that way. Okay, And one of the reasons is that we've both been approaching these areas in parallel, using our experiences, our disciplines, and thinking about vegetation and fire. Okay, so here's a continuum. On the far left, you see wildland areas. These are completely undeveloped, no buildings, no roads, just completely natural, wild. Okay, you see a lot of that in throughout the United States. And then in the other extreme, we see urban areas, the urban core, mostly impervious surfaces, mostly homes, very small lots. But in between, here's where we have this wild and urban interface transition. Okay, so from the left side, we've approached that from the wild and urban interface perspective. On the right hand, we approach it from an urban perspective. So let's go a little bit into both of these areas and how we've been thinking about and managing vegetation. So let's think about that left side of that continuum, the wildland and the wildland urban interface. Okay? So on the right, you see four images. The upper right hand shows Paradise, California, and that's a satellite image. And the red is the amount of vegetation. Blue are the buildings and the impervious surfaces. So one thing you see is that these areas are predominantly vegetation. So there's more vegetation than there is buildings or impervious surfaces. And when we go underneath those trees and look at it, things on the ground, we see continuous patches of vegetation, houses right next to these vegetation. So when we do get a fire, the fire burns continuously from the vegetation into the homes. So one approach we've been using this concept that was developed about 20, 30 years called the home ignition zones, that if we remove vegetation in the proximity of homes, we interrupt that continuity of vegetation, what we call fuels, and thereby it provides space for firefighters to go to access a home and protect it. But it also reduces the probability of vegetation catching on fire and that vegetation catching that building on fire. And this has really proven to be effective in wildland urban interface areas. Homes that are in large tracts, homes that are surrounded by continuous patches of vegetation. So from this perspective, we think of vegetation as a cost. We need to remove that vegetation to improve that benefit of home protection. So again, for the wildland urban interface, areas that are predominantly vegetation, that's been really effective. On the other hand, in urban areas, we've been promoting urban forestry as a means of increasing community well-being through vegetation. And we've done a really great job of informing folks on the benefit of that vegetation and of promoting the use of that vegetation. However, in fire-prone landscapes, and again, I'll get into this, it's just not California, sometimes this vegetation can lead to problems, as you kind of alluded to in that previous email. But when we think about these urban environments, we see the similar four images here. On the upper right, you see a satellite image. This is in Ventura, California. And as you can see, that red color is vegetation. Blue is building and impervious. What we start seeing in urban areas, though, is that there's more buildings, more impervious than there is vegetation. Okay? And if we looked under that tree cover, we start seeing different species, different arrangements. We start seeing shrubs of different species. We start seeing different pruning practices, mulches, turfs, lawns. Some are irrigated, some aren't irrigated. So it's a lot more complex than in wildland areas. The other thing we see in these environments is the presence of people. So when these areas are affected by fire, we no longer see this continuous spread of fire from the vegetation to homes. Rather, it gets very spotty and it gets very complex very quickly. So there's an image of a house that burned in Altadena right next to a house that didn't burn. And you see the vegetation surrounding the burned home is intact. And what happened there was the home caught on fire and caught the vegetation on fire. So this has been, we've all been sitting around scratching our heads trying to figure out what's going on, because what we've learned in the wildland urban interface is that by everything we know, that house should have been lost on the right there, but it's not, it's intact. Whereas the other house that was burned probably wasn't burned by the vegetation, it was burned by other reasons. So now when we try to apply these practices from fire management that we've learned in the wildland urban interface to cities, we run into highly complex environments, uh, parcels of land where every property, every home is managed differently. The plants on that plot are different. You no longer have these large continuous patches of vegetation where you can do these defensible space areas. We have different folks, different incomes, different vegetations, so just highly complex environments. Okay, so keep those principles in mind. So I've been focused on California and giving you a lot of examples from this part of the world. But really, this fire is now not just this problem is not just here in California. We've had these fires affecting neighborhoods in Colorado, Southern Oregon, Hawaii a couple of years ago, 2 3 weeks ago. Neighborhoods in Chile, South America, were affected. 30 people lost their lives. So this is a problem that communities are now encountering, specifically urban communities. So what a lot of folks are proposing now, that rather than thinking about these as wildfires or wildland urban interface fires, we start thinking about these as urban fires, urban conflagrations. Okay, so let's get a little bit into that, into what it is. Okay, so remember I told you that in wildland areas, as the vegetation burns, it spreads to the house through flames, right? The flames catch things on fire. Whereas in urban areas, it's now radiant heat. There's embers that are being transported away from that source of that fire source. And these embers could be transported up to 1.5 miles, as previously mentioned. Homes are built differently. There's different properties. There's different vegetation. So it's just very complex, leading to that example I told you about previously. Okay, so let's get into a little bit more about these fires in these cities. But before I do, some realities. Okay, so there's no such thing as a fire-resistant plant. All plants will burn if you expose them to enough heat. However, some plants, the greener they are, the more it takes for them to ignite. Some plants, when they ignite, release more heat than others. Some plants sustain that fire for longer periods of time than other plants, so there is some nuance there. Uh, Home hardening, that's what we call the practices you can undertake in your home to reduce the probability of it igniting. Double pane windows, filters on your vents that are a little bit finer and don't allow the embers to go into your attic, the type of siding you use, separating wooden fences from your home or using other materials for fences. All those are home hardening practices. But even those can fail under certain conditions. The other reality we have in urban areas is that vegetation is highly valued because of its benefits. And in general, the drier your community is, the more people value those trees, again, because there's a scarcity of that resource. The more scarce it is, the greater the demand or the value that people place on. Very different from areas that are very green, where there's a lot of vegetation, where removing some of that vegetation will not impact the amount of green. So vegetation is valuable to many people. So keep that in mind. And as I mentioned, in these cities, it's people. So this isn't just a home vegetation issue, it's a people issue as well. Okay. So let's keep those 4 principles in mind as we move to these other examples. So to summarize, fire in the wildland urban interface, there's a long history of research, experiences. We can see that the use of controlled fires or prescribed fires can reduce the risk. It can improve habitat. A lot of these species have evolved around fire, so that's a good thing. Whereas when we go back to fire in urban areas, there's generally little varied benefits. I can't think of any benefits. Loss of property, loss of lives. Those native species that we're using in the city aren't adapted to highly impervious surfaces. Soils have been altered. It's hotter, warmer. People bring in different types of species. They irrigate differently. They prune differently. And again, we have people and different kinds of people living in cities than in the wild. Okay. So given that background, now I'm going to jump into some research that we've been doing here in California. I'll give you some research that we started a couple of years ago trying to understand this problem of fire affecting neighborhoods. We'll get into an issue we've been having here in California, where laws are being proposed to remove vegetation around homes because of fire risk. I'll show you some research where we accounted for some of these nuances I told you about earlier. And then some research that we started a year ago when we had these fires in Los Angeles with regard to trees and how they did during these fires. Okay, so 3 graphs. I promise to only show you 2 slides with graphs. It's a research, so it wouldn't be fair if I didn't show you any graphs. Okay, but here's three graphs of 3 different communities that were impacted by fire. And UTC is urban tree cover. So we have urban tree cover in Ventura, California, urban tree cover in Santa Rosa, California, and urban tree cover in Paradise, California. Okay, so in that vertical graph, we have the amount of urban tree cover, and in the horizontal graph, we have time from 2016 to 2020. We have a little red arrow. That arrow shows when those 3 communities were impacted by different wildfires. Okay. The solid line indicates fire-affected neighborhoods, neighborhoods that burned over and lost their tree cover. And then that dashed line is the tree cover in adjacent neighborhoods that were not affected by fire. So what these 3 graphs are telling us is that in Ventura, Santa Rosa, 2 or 3 years after those neighborhoods were affected by fire, the tree cover recovered to the same level of tree covers in adjacent neighborhoods that were not affected by wildfire. Okay, so 2 years, the vegetation recovered to levels that were not affected by fire. Whereas in Paradise, after the campfire in 2018, the communities experienced a loss in continuous tree cover. Tree cover has not recovered and is continuously being lost. Okay? So what can we learn from from this study and these 3 graphs? So communities and urban forests respond differently. Communities are located in different geographies, different climates. The people living in those communities are different. They have different resources. The species composition, the amount of vegetation is different. So communities will respond differently. But if you look at the case of Ventura and Santa Rosa, what we see is that tree cover can recover to pre-fire levels in as little as 2 years. Okay, so another pointer to keep in mind as we go through this presentation, these research findings. Okay, so we talked about trees over time. Let's talk about people and communities over time with regard to fire. So, and these will be the last graphs I show you, I promise. So this graph, the vertical graph, shows the amount of urban communities affected by wildfire in California. The horizontal graph is time. So these are the communities, urban communities that have been impacted by wildfire from 2010 to 2020. So what you see here is an increase. Every year, more and more urban communities will be impacted by wildfire. Okay. When we start looking at those communities, we start seeing some interesting things. So that solid line are the urban communities that were impacted by wildfire. Those dashed lines are statewide communities that were not impacted by wildfire. I wanted to see if communities that were impacted by wildfire were different from the rest of California. But what this graph shows is that renters are increasingly being affected by wildfire during that time period. And if we looked at regions of California, we see that Asian Americans were increasingly being impacted by wildfire in coastal sage areas. So this is basically Southern California, areas where chaparral predominates. And then in other parts of California, inland Northern California, Hispanics were increasingly being impacted by wildfire. So what does this mean? Different demographics, different folks are being impacted by wildfire. So this has started the process of thinking about how we communicate these impacts, how we communicate evacuation messages, for example, homeowner education on not just urban forests, but fire risk. Okay, so again, different demographics are being impacted by wildfires, by these urban fires. Okay, so keep that in mind. So now I'm going to show you about how this issue has come to a head recently in the state of California, and it's proposing a law that requires that vegetation be removed within 5 feet of a home to reduce fire risk. A lot of this information is coming from the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety and other and studies, I'm sorry, and other organizations where they model homes inside of warehouses. Then they do different trials with fire, and they change the type of building, all those home hardening practices I told you about, double pane windows, the type of siding they use, the type of decks, the experiments with they do experiments with different rates of fire, different rates of fire. But basically, a lot of that same information has been used to develop this policy. So thinking back about our realities in urban areas, that they're so complex, the species composition, how they're pruned, how they're maintained, how they're watered, is really not being taken into consideration with these studies. So what we try to do is a study where we try to account for vegetation types and the role of moisture in what homes are lost or what homes survive during these fires we've had here in California. So we use satellite imagery from a day before the fires or the evening before the fire. We tested over 16,000 homes. We mapped out the vegetation types around those homes in that specific parcel, in that specific property. And then we accounted for vegetation density, its location, and moisture. How much moisture those different vegetation types around those individual homes had. And then we use statistics to see which of these factors were most relevant to the house being lost or the house being survived. And again, the objective of our study was to see how vegetation types, whether it's trees, groups of trees, shrubs, herbaceous, had a role in building loss or survival, and the role of that vegetation moisture in those buildings surviving loss. So what do we find? All right, so I have Ventura on the left, and we have Paradise on the right. We have three different defensible space zones. Buffer 1, which is 0 to 5 feet from the home. Zone 2, Zone 3 for Ventura and for Paradise, okay? So this is the list of most influential predictors that were related to building loss in Ventura, Southern California, and Paradise, Northern California. So what we see in Ventura is that in that first buffer, the 0 to 5, it was low bare ground cover and low tree moisture that were most related to buildings being lost in Ventura. Okay? And then in the second and third, we start seeing that herbaceous moisture, shrub moisture, and then building density start to be influential predictors of building loss. Whereas in Paradise, it was bare ground, but then the presence of overstory cover was related to building. So vegetation moisture didn't matter. What type of vegetation you had around the home is as you had vegetation over your home, there was a high, it was an influential predictor of building loss. Paradise Golf. But if we take that same method and look at survival of buildings and the vegetation characteristics, we see that in Ventura, high tree moisture was a significant predictor of home survival. All right, so that's interesting. So again, we didn't account for what the homeowners were doing during the fire. We accounted for the types of building practices, but it seems to show here that at least in Ventura, California, high tree moisture was influential in that building survival. Okay? So the other research we're doing now in Los Angeles, I'm going to show you two examples. We have other research projects going on. One, we looked at neighborhood characteristics, not just the vegetation and tree characteristics, but we also looked at those demographics, those community characteristics, ethnicity, income, education, and how they were related to building loss in both Altadena and Pacific Palisades. And then in another study, we focused in on trees and how trees fared during these two fire events and whether their size, their species, whether they were natives, non-natives, how they varied in terms of fire damage. Okay, so looking at the neighborhood level, at the big picture characteristics, we found that 15% of homes had another home within 5 feet. And we also found that on average, every home had two homes within 30 feet. So thinking back to this home ignition zone, defensible space, we're calling for the removal of vegetation within 5 feet, but 15-70% of homes had another home within 5 feet. And then if we increase that defensible space a little bit more, we see that there's two homes with 30 feet. So they're proposing the removing of vegetation, but what about these homes? We also found that in the Eden Fire in Altadena, the demographics were a lot more diverse. Almost 50% were African American, Hispanic, Asian American. A lot of these folks did not speak English. And then we have a couple of other different characteristics for those homes. Palisades, a more affluent area. Eaton was a more middle class. Different tree covers and the incomes were different. So how about in terms of these community characteristics and damage? Okay, so bunch of graphs with different lines running through them. Don't want to show you that we did use statistics, but focus on the red text. Okay, so this is basically what we found in both Altadena and Pacific Palisades. The more buildings you had, whether that was measured using the proximity of those buildings to each other or the amount of building footprints over a given area, was related to greater home damage after the fires in both Pacific Palisades and Altadena. But when we get to tree cover, we start seeing some really complex things. In Palisades, the more tree cover in a neighborhood, the less home destruction. Whereas in Altadena, the more trees you had in a neighborhood, marginally more destruction. So very complex, right? Two different relationships for these two different communities. And then when it came to demographic characteristics, we saw that areas and neighborhoods that were predominantly African American suffered more damage. People that did not, areas where people had less education in terms of college education, bachelor's degrees, experienced more damage. So again, this is more than just a tree cover and building density issue. It's also a people issue. And then this other component, and we had help from Cal State Northridge, Dr. Jeremy Yoder helped us with some of the statistics. We went in, sampled over 2,000 trees in Altadena, Pacific Palisades, measured for the amount of damage in the crown, the stem, a whole series of metrics. And this is what we found. Don't focus on the graphs, but look at the findings on the right. So we didn't see any clear patterns in terms of species or in terms of whether they were native or non-native. Where we did see statistical relationships was in trees that had higher tree crowns had less damage. Trees that had wider tree crowns had more damage. And we can get a little bit into why we might be seeing some of these patterns. Okay, but on average, at the tree level, whether it was a native tree or a non-native tree, didn't matter. What mattered was the height of its crown and the width of its crown. Those were the characteristics that we identified as statistically significant. And if we think about in practical terms, those are things we can manage for, regardless of species or regardless of whether they were native, right? What we do with the crown, how we prune, how we maintain those trees. Okay. So to wrap up, these are kind of 4 take-home messages that this is kind of my opinion, but I'm hopefully sharing this from a lot of the same opinions that a lot of the people we've been collaborating with have come to regarding these urban fires. Okay, so the urban environment is very different than the wildland urban interface. So fire impacts are going to be different. Vegetation is going to be different. People are going to be different. So we need to start looking at these areas very differently. In terms of vegetation and building loss, what we've been seeing, as opposed to some of the engineer-based studies from other parts of the country that have found that relationship between vegetation and building loss, we see that it's very complex. Some communities, tree cover seems to be influential in home loss. In other communities, it does not. We can get a little bit into in the discussion. But regardless of that, what we found in all our studies and what multiple other studies have found is that the more building density you have, the closer those homes are next to each other, the more damage. And that's a direct relationship. Not complex, it's pretty common, pretty direct. What we have seen, though, with this, if you take all these studies and you try to put them to practical terms or applied terms, is that tree maintenance matters. Tree crown heights, which we can manage using pruning, moisture, which we can manage using irrigation, seem to make a difference in how these trees are impacted, but even indicating the possibility that might even have uh, a probability of reducing the emission of your home. Right? We didn't see any clear patterns in terms of fire damage, but again, tree characteristics. So getting back to the saying we always use in urban forestry, right tree in the right place for the right reason, but maintenance also. And then finally, as we've been going through this, trying to manage this issue and thinking about it, um, it's interesting because we keep using the term unprecedented. But as you see in those two images on your right, the upper right is an image of Altadena, 2025, exactly a year ago. But if we start thinking back 200, 150 years ago, we used to have these same types of events. Not only here in California, as shown in that picture on the bottom in 1906, but in Chicago, in Europe, in Asia, where these urban areas have been affected by fire. And probably the reason you stop seeing those types of events is because of building practices. Less use of wooden buildings, improved infrastructure for delivering water, gas. So all these improvements probably stopped these events from occurring. And it's only recently that we've started seeing these events. Okay? So I don't have any numbers yet, but it seems to make sense that what we're seeing now used to happen in the past. Okay? So thank you. And if you have any questions, glad to answer them.
Thank you so much, Francisco. That was very illuminating. I think those of us in this area are can make those connections with some of your research and what we saw on the ground. And um, yeah, a lot of great research, and there's a lot of good questions too. So I'll just get right into the questions.
Sure.
Um, so going back to when you were talking about the difference between Paradise, Recovery in Paradise and Santa Rosa and how quickly the vegetation came back. Someone was asking if that was mostly due to the original trees healing from recovering from the fire, as opposed to being damaged to the point of removal, or is it due to replanting efforts in those communities?
Okay. So planting a tree takes time. And for that tree to become established and start growing can take decades. Okay. So what you're seeing here is the response of those trees that were affected by fire, not new and newly planted trees. But paradise is basically a forest that was urbanized. It's higher elevation, it's in Northern California, whereas in Ventura and Santa Rosa, those were shrub dominated areas that were then planted with trees. So what you're seeing there in Santa Rosa and Ventura is a lot of the chaparral species, the shrubland species, and a lot of the oak species resprouting fairly quick. And you see that in wildland areas that after a fire, those vegetation types, those landscapes regenerate fairly quickly.
Hmm.
Whereas in higher elevation, pine, conifer dominated forests, it can take decades for that vegetation to come back. So a lot of research has shown this is globally that even though composition and structure can be a little bit different in urban areas, it often mimics the surrounding biome or the eco,
Hmm.
right? Because vegetation, climate is similar in cities and next to cities. It's those maintenance practices and
Hmm.
influence that makes them different, urban versus urban areas.
Yes, that does make sense. Yeah, someone saying so it's vegetation that's counting as canopy. And then someone else was asking about the wider canopy over a building versus a more vertical. Um,
Yeah, so that's something interesting we saw. So again, that was in the case of Paradise. That's a forest that became urbanized. People constructed their homes, and they constructed them often under trees. So these are predominantly pine trees that shed leaves, that shed needles, lots of needles every year. So a lot of those needles are probably on the roof, on the gutters, homes.
mm,
So that may have had a role. Okay. Whereas in Ventura, there's less trees, probably more ornamental trees, probably better placed trees. They're irrigated, they're pruned, and that's what we saw that statistical difference where trees with
Hmm.
high moisture were related to the ability to survive. Whereas in Paradise, tree moisture didn't matter. If you had trees over your home, chances are it was lost.
Okay, interesting. And I'm going to tie that into this is my colleague Alejandra is asking about defensible space. And I think like the connection between tree canopy, but also the vegetation and the surface components like mulch or
Right.
dry mulch or dry leaves versus moist mulch that's retaining moisture. Um, her comment, I'm just going to read it aloud. She says this is all very interesting. Our fears that the idea of defensible space could be interpreted as having less vegetation and fewer trees being better. So all of your findings are helpful because it's not black and white.
That's it.
Um,
That's the take home message. It's really complex. It's not black or white, it's not binary.
okay, yes. Do you know if building and city planning regulations, insurance companies are incorporating your research and the knowledge that you presented to us today?
Yeah, so it's been interesting. So this is new. We just published this last year. And then, but one of the issues, there's been similar studies that have looked at this relationship between the amount of vegetation and homes being lost. There's a researcher called Alexandra Seifert and John Peel that have done that. But they use vegetation types. So they don't differentiate between trees, shrubs, herbaceous, different tree species, densities. It's just broad vegetation types. The insurance folks have used their controlled trial experiments. So what they do, they have a warehouse in South Carolina. They have different configurations of buildings and shrubs, and then they blow fire into them. So it's great. It's a controlled experiment, but from us being on the ground, we know that the real world is a lot more complex than that. So there's that issue.
Wow.
The other issue that some of these folks have said about our study is that we don't account for firefighter actions or whether the homeowner was out there putting embers. That's all true. Um, However, the same probably holds to these other insurance related studies that they're highly controlled. They don't account for what the folks are doing, whether it's been 20 years since they recommended that treatment and the wood started to rot, or all these other factors. So to make a long story short, um, they don't seem to really be. Uh, they really haven't come out and adopted this research. I think they feel that their controlled experiments probably get
Mm,
better um, at their purposes.
hmm.
What we're trying to do with these studies is not say that um, all vegetation should be maintained all the time. What we're saying is that it's not black and white. There's no such thing
Hmm.
as vegetation. Just like for them, there's no such thing as buildings. There's homes, multifamily. There's homes that
Right.
can have double pane windows, siding that's not as flammable. They can separate the wooden fence. So they call that home hardening. So
Yes.
what we're proposing is landscape hardening. There is no such thing to us urban foresters as vegetation. It's tree type, shrub type,
Yeah.
pruning practices, moisture, where you place that tree, how you maintain that tree. So I think that's where we're trying to make progress. We're not trying to say that all vegetation should be conserved all the time. However, we're trying to inform their message that because all vegetation burns, all vegetation is bad, so it should all be removed. What we're saying is people like trees, people want trees. Yes, a lot of people shouldn't have trees, certain trees, maintain a certain way next to their homes, but there are practices that we can use to reduce that probability, and we're trying to come to that middle ground, all right, where it's
Yes.
not all this straw man fallacy that all vegetation burns, so it should all be removed. In the
Hmm.
north, in the northern, where you have more precipitation, people are probably a bit more tolerant of having vegetation removed because there's so much green in their communities. Here, in a lot of parts of the western U.S., Southern
Hmm.
California, for example, there's just not that much vegetation. It's very
Yes.
hot. It's very sunny. So people really value that shade. So trying to remove that one, two trees they have in their yards, or that rose bush or azalea bush, is just not coming across very well. And a lot of people are getting really angry. So again, we're not,
Yeah.
as a public servant, as a scientist, I'm just trying to be objective and saying this argument needs to be a lot more nuanced. And that information is not there. And the information we're getting from your experiments in these warehouses, it just doesn't hold.
Mm.
And the way we're messaging is just not uh, it's just not convincing a lot of people. You need to change the way.
Yes.
So I'm trying to be objective, but
Yeah.
so thanks for that question, Alejandro.
Yeah, and we understand it's complex, including the messaging and and like we recognize the care that you're all taking and how that message comes out. Um, so kind of related to that, thinking about uh native plants, especially in places that are meant to burn. I think of our Southern California habitat and how we educate children about our connection with nature. Um, so that's one question. And then one of my colleagues is asking about that tension between defensible space and tree planting, thinking about schools that reside in not only the WOWI but the intermix area. And if the Forest Service is developing any guidelines around your findings, that could be helpful
Yeah,
for.
so we're starting to roll. So usually the way we work is we need to go through the scientific process. So we do the research, then we send it out to peers. They look through it, they identify the limitations, we try to account for them. We have this publication process, and then once it's peer reviewed, then we start developing those practices. So we're barely getting there. But if we think about fire, and if I showed those preliminary findings where whether the tree was native or not native didn't make a difference, and the species didn't make a difference. Let's delve a little bit into that, and then we can kind of bring it back to the question. So, what's a native tree? So it could be a coast live oak, or it could be sycamore. Coast live oaks maintain their leaves year round. Sycamores don't. So these fires occurred in January, right? So a lot of these native trees and non-native trees didn't have their leaves, so they weren't damaged. So that's one thing, right? When we use this term
Mhm.
native, uh, and we think about fire or a specific objective we're trying to use native trees for, we have to account for it, right? That if you have leaves on a tree, when you have fire, um, that needs to be considered. How flammable those leaves are needs to be considered. How green
Mhm.
those leaves are. How moist. So the example I always give, and we saw this a lot. We've been seeing a lot of the communities, and we just haven't been working here in Southern California. We've worked in Colorado and Southern Oregon also. Is if you take, for example, eucalyptus trees have a reputation of being really flammable. Go up like Roman candles, people say. But what we've seen is if you have a eucalyptus tree in a yard that's well maintained, well watered, well pruned, same species in a lot that has never been pruned, that has brush, litter, dead branches from the bottom all the way to the top, and it's always at drought, at wilting point. Same tree, same species, same location, but because of maintenance, they'll react very differently to fire, right? And that makes sense. And then the other question we get into is when you talk about natives, you have to talk about plant type. Is it a palm or is it a tree? We've seen palms react very differently under fire than trees. Trees react very differently than shrubs. So, in terms of fire, when we talk about native and non native, it's a little bit too broad of a term. We need to talk about
Mhm.
tree type. How dense that crown is. Is it year round? How much litter does it produce? How moist it is? How many organic compounds it has that make it highly flammable?
Mhm.
Where we place them relative to the house.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm glad that those things are being developed, and I know that a lot of people are very interested in hearing that. But
You know
yeah,
what?
the nuance is important.
And one thing, unfortunately, that's the That's the name of the game in urban forestry, right? Is trying to deal with these trade-offs. So unfortunately, not just here in Southern California, the Western United States, but as I've shown you globally, these communities are being impacted by fire. So now we have something additional to deal with, right? Another trade-off.
Yes.
Fire risk,
Yes.
or is it wildlife habitat? Is it water use, or is it fire risk, or is it stormwater, right? So that's one
Hmm.
more thing that we kind of include in our
Yes. We just have a few minutes left, and I first want to ask if my colleague wants to chime in at all. I just see she's unmuted, but maybe not. Alejandra, no.
Oh no, no, I'm really interested. No, I don't
Okay.
say.
So I think maybe like there's so many other questions that I have that we're thinking of and our team will probably think of to ask you at a later time. But maybe to wrap up is thinking about kids that live in these areas, including kids that experience fire themselves. I know I was evacuated as a kid, and the kids that, from Altadena and thinking about Chile and Colorado. What kind of messaging would you encourage adults to share with children that don't villainize trees, but kind of, reassure them of our connection to nature? And yeah.
Well, what a great question. Honestly, I wish I knew because again, all this has been new. Um, a lot of the things we've seen in these neighborhoods that have been affected by wildfire in the past is that the demographics really change. And so the question about the language needs, the way we educate folks needs to be different because they're different communities. After these communities experience wildfire, there's a real displacement. So one of the numbers I didn't show in Paradise, I'm not up to the exact population numbers now, but as of a couple of years ago, I think the population dropped from 20,000 to 6,000. So there was a lot of displacement. In a lot of places like Pacific Palisades, where people are probably more affluent, the community dynamics will probably be similar. But in places like Altadena, it's going to change, right? So I think that the benefits of trees are there. They've been documented. Again, in places that are lacking trees are highly valuable. So I think those are great opportunities for kids to learn about.
Mhm.
But just like floods, like earthquakes, right? And how we respond and react and educate communities towards those events, we'll probably have to design messaging around these fires as we do with earthquakes, flooding, right? These kinds of events.
Yes, yes. And our team has been connected with folks in this area impacted by the fires. And as people are starting to rebuild, revisiting their connection with trees. And it sounds like there is a lot of good conversation about not villainizing trees and, yeah, both mourning the loss of their community trees and then how to honor them. We've spoken to groups that are trying to uh, water the trees in Altadena, right, to keep them alive. Also, other groups that are repurposing the trees that had to be removed. And then, another question I might ask at a later time is about cultural burn practices and things like that. And again, how this translates to what we are encouraging kids to learn about in school and stewarding the trees on their campuses. Um, so we're at time, unfortunately. But there's a few extra questions. We'll email you at a later time. And I just want to thank you for your research and all the work that you're doing and that you and many other people are doing to get people on some kind of common understanding of
That's
the reality. Yeah.
And finally, Lauren, this isn't just my research. As Chris Sjogren was in here, he helped a lot with this research. Folks from UC Davis, University of Florida, UCLA, UC Extension, Altadena Green, folks from Pacific Palisades, Paradise have been really helpful with this research.
Right. So thank you again, Francisco, and good luck with your further research.
Thank you, Lauren. Thanks for the invitation.
Yes. Thanks, everyone. Have a nice day.